Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Vital Descent. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarlane. This one is episode 283. The show notes may be found at vitaldescent.com/283. And in this episode, we're going to be discussing Dracula by Bram Stoker. As I mentioned at the end of last week's podcast about The Giver. And I think it's going to be really interesting. This is maybe my second or third time reading Dracula. And this is one where it was like, I was way overthinking it doing the episode. And I was like, well, if I don't just do it, then I'm not going to do it. And then I'm going to get stumbled and just not come out with episodes for you guys. So I'm also going to be talking about The Passage by Justin Cronin, which is the first book in a trilogy that he put out in the mid-2010s that got a lot of attention, although I'd never heard of it before, like a few months ago. So this is the first book in a trilogy. It is a post-apocalyptic vampire novel, and there's actually a straight-up reference to Dracula in it. And I think that comparing the two off of each other is going to be really interesting, talking about fiction and, I guess, horror, and how I think that we need a new generation of horror in terms of like innovation. Because, and this is, I'll get into this, but horror seems to me to be something that is identifying either a past, and this is really, Dracula is like the conjunction of these things, where identifying legends from the past, but also with an eye toward the future, and these two things interacting on a plane. So I think pretty excited for this one. Then Dracula, a lot of people, I would assume that a lot of people have not read Dracula. And we talked in Blood Meridian episode 281/281 for the show notes. We talked in Blood Meridian about how some people like Wendigoon in his video claimed that the judge from that book was maybe the best villain in all of fiction ever. And I mean, I don't know if that's like a purposefully hyperbolic claim, or if that is, I didn't listen to his arguments to see what he said. So like, hopefully I'm not going to straw man him, because I'm not even quoting the actual arguments that he made. Like, granted, the judge is a very interesting, scary, haunting, complicated, iconic character. But if you're thinking about all this, like, I just can't, I can't sit here and not, like, Dracula has to be in the conversation of the greatest villain in all of fiction. Even bigger, I would think, than Frankenstein, even though Frankenstein's monster, if you want to be really technical about it, that Frankenstein's monster is very influential and is iconic and is a great villain, fictional villain. I would say the title would have to go with Dracula. And in this book, Bram Stoker, for those of you who haven't read it, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. If this isn't the type of thing, like if kind of Victorianish Gothic horror novels are not your thing, you might not enjoy this. Although I would say that of those, this is definitely one of the more accessible ones. Like, you can really get into reading that type of like Gothic horror, and it doesn't read like a dime novel. It doesn't read like a mass market paperback. It definitely has the trappings of the era. And I would say that you might struggle with some of it, like the Castle of Otranto, or I always say that one wrong, but that's highly touted as being like the first Gothic horror novel or story. And I actually did a podcast that had like 5 or 6 episodes called Unhallowed with my wife a few years ago. And here's the page. If you look it up on Spotify or, wherever you get your podcast, you can see we did like 6 episodes back in 2020. So kind of like during the pandemic, talking about a lot of these things. So we talked about the Castle of Otranto. We had a couple episodes on that. We defined what Gothic horror is. So I'll try and put these in the show notes if those of you like who are actually really into this kind of stuff, we did a few deep dives on it. We did the Castle of Otranto, the Signal Man and Premonitions of Death, the Grotesque and the Hellbound Heart, which is the Hellraiser series with Clive Barker, being a modern example of a like purely kind of gothic horror. And then we did the Monkey's Paw, which I talked about in a past episode here on the podcast, and then Psychotic Breaks and the Telltale Heart. So we did a little Poe as well. Really enjoyed doing that. So check that out. It's my wife and I did that. Really fun. Maybe we'll pick it up sometime. It was a fun time, but we got busy with the kids. So she could have easily joined me for this one because this is just how we met, was in a class, a gothic horror fiction class. So just special to us as a couple. But those of you who haven't read it, it's written, I forget the name of this, but it's written in a way to where they, like, it's like a found footage film. It's like an example of a found footage film where the book is just diary entries and newspaper clippings. And I think it's like kind of an ingenious way that Bram Stoker puts it together. Like, I'm sure he wasn't the first one to do this, but he does it in a way that's really interesting, where like all these characters are banding together to defeat Dracula. And it's kind of meta in the sense that they reference the diary entries that they're making, knowing that other people are going to read them. But those people are definitely like, you know, the other people in their group who are fighting against Dracula. But it could just as easily be the audience who's reading the book. And it has kind of that like Blair Witch Project feel to it, where you feel like this could be like a leather-bound journal or something that was just like a stack of papers that were collected together in different formats. I think at this point, the plot of the book is probably pretty well known, but my first exposure to it was the Francis Ford Coppola film, Bram Stoker's Dracula from the 90s, with Keanu Reeves and Winona Ryder and Anthony Hopkins. Really enjoyed that. It was like really a foundational film experience for my young self. And of course, you know, there's boobies in it. So that was, you know, for an adolescent, that was really exciting. So if you don't, you know, pick up on the horror aspects of it, I feel like it's all kind of bound together for people who like horror and sex and boobies and Dracula. I actually have a Dracula chest piece inspired by that film that I'm not going to show for the audience here, but it's on the one hand, it's Vlad Tepes, which I know is like not super pure, but then there's a castle in the middle, and then on the other pec, I have from that movie, that scene where it's Dracula's he's with Mina on the bed, and he turns into that like beast figure who's like, you know, a bat, kind of the bat form of that. So I was a chess piece I was working on for a long time. But I really enjoyed this read through. I also I don't think it really dragged all that much, but I think I picked up on a few things that I didn't pick up before. And to tie into the theme of kind of what we're talking about, what I wanted to make this episode about was what you're really seeing with Dracula, I think, is the tying together of technology and scientism with the old world beliefs, and seeing those two things interact and having this iconic villain emerge from it is really interesting. And I think it's part of why this book has stood the test of time, because it wasn't the first vampire book. It wasn't the first vampire fiction book. And of course, the legend of vampires has been around for 1,000+ years. I think even ancient Egypt had a figure, like a vampire type figure. And you just see this legend ever present in so many different cultures in some form or another. And what you have, and this came out in 1897, so kind of put yourself in that time where kind of middle of the Industrial Revolution, probably like further towards the back end of that. And you have science evolving and all that kind of stuff mixing with ancient legends, and still a large portion of the world that is not caught up at the same time. So there's, various backwaters, but also like you have the head of scientific movements happening in Europe and, the Americas, North America, but in London and Germany and Austria and France, that kind of thing. These movements going, scientific advances being made and understandings. And if we're thinking about iconic literature and iconic horror, specifically those cornerstones being Frankenstein's monster and Dracula. And I mean, I'm thinking Universal monsters as well. Like the Wolfman and the Mummy and all these different things that people get obsessed with, but also zombies. Like think about zombie films from the mid 2000s, right? You really have, this could be a whole separate podcast, but there was a huge zombie craze in the mid 2000s. And there was something about the social contagion element of that really resonated with people. And I don't know if it was like Occupy Wall Street that did that, because I was kind of in high school at the time. But I think that the zombie thing predated that a little bit. And I'm really kind of thinking of, you had 28 Days Later that came out. I think that was like the late 90s or the early 2000s. And that's where I would kind of start the clock on the modern zombie craze. Because in the 60s, right, you had George A. Romero coming out with zombie films. And I think that really resonated because there was kind of like a Red Scare element to it. And I'm not like, I haven't thought this a whole lot through, but there was a Red Scare element to it. And just kind of going with conformity of the crowd, picking up on those kind of social commentary elements. And I think good horror kind of does that. Like it points out, gives social commentary, points out things, points out general like directions of where the current is flowing at the time. And I think that we're really in need of a modern revolution of sorts, like pushing, how can we take horror in the modern era and push it forward and make progress in the genre and use it as a tool to confront this rapidly changing world and rapidly changing dystopia that we're catapulting into. And I think that maybe first I should kind of summarize Dracula and point out where this comes in the story. So the plot of Dracula, and this is where I kind of resonate with it in a different way on this reading, because I think the last time I read it was for class in college, for my undergrad, in that class where I met my wife. Maybe I did one reading between then and now, so in the last 10 years. But I'm a lawyer now, and Jonathan Harker is a lawyer. Like I'm pretty sure, like a solicitor is the British version of a lawyer. I'm pretty sure he's not a real estate agent or something like that, but he is kind of the aristocracy a little bit. I wouldn't say I don't think he's a nobleman at all. There is some class commentary in Dracula about people's places, and you kind of see that. But he goes on this trip. I couldn't imagine doing this as a lawyer, like going on this trip across a continent to give bedside service to a nobleman who we've never seen except corresponded by letter, going out to the backwaters of Eastern Europe and working with him to sign deeds for an estate purchase. And thinking that, well, maybe this could have been done all by post. Not really sure, but being, kind of uncomfortable with it, but also thinking like, well, this is a huge burden and I want payment in advance, right? I'm just thinking from my perspective as, a solo practicing attorney business owner. And he goes to Transylvania or Romania, I think it is, and he goes by himself, and all the way there are these omens. And the biggest thing about Dracula is that it's not, there are parts that are actiony, but in a very like sense of the time, it's a lot of dread and foreboding and atmosphere, which is really cool, but doesn't play quite as well for the modern audience. And there are all these, and this is where you get the kind of the institution or like the introduction of the idea of backwards people. Because as he's going along, Harker is a little bit snooty, and he is commenting on, well, these people have their crazy superstitions and I don't believe them. They're backwards and whatever. So he goes to the castle and he's immediately like kind of freaked out by Dracula, who is this, at the same time that he's foreboding and kind of evil feeling, he's very classy and also, you know, aristocratic and kind of charming, but just very devious. I mean, you know Dracula, right? Everyone listening to this probably knows that, like, that dichotomy of Dracula, of him being, you know, this well-to-do, put-together aristocratic individual who has, you know, lived for centuries, has honor in a sense of defending his people. And there's some commentary about that and from Dracula during their conversations. But Harker slowly comes to realize that he's not a guest anymore, that he's a prisoner in the castle, and that he's facilitated this real estate deal for Dracula to come to England. And I think that transfer in of itself is very symbolic of the book. The point the book is kind of trying to pick at, that we're in a handover from a certain type of old world into the new world. And Dracula is recognizing that there's nothing really left for him in Transylvania, that the feudal world that he's, you know, known for so much of his life is kind of going away, and he wants to be a part of this new world that's changing. And I don't know if he wants to reinvent himself, if he's having like a midlife crisis or something. So he does this transfer, and he secures help from Renfield. And I can't remember exactly how. I don't know if, because in Nosferatu, the new movie that came out, the Renfield character is the former solicitor who went to Dracula and started, you know, became his thrall basically, and started losing his mind when he came back to London doing errands for Dracula himself. And that part's a little fuzzy because, I mean, to be honest, I read this book like 3 books ago, before Christmas, I think, was when I read it. So some of the plot details are a little fuzzy. But you have Mina back, Jonathan Harker's wife, or his fiance, waiting for him in London, hanging out with her aristocratic friend Lucy. And Lucy is a lot more, I think in the book, she's a lot more well-to-do and put together than she's portrayed in the Coppola film, where she's portrayed in that film as kind of being like a floozy a little bit, kind of being a flirt. But I think that in the book, she's a lot more sophisticated, but also, like, I mean, there's a little bit of that. So she's kind of in courtship with a few different men, Dr. Seward, Arthur Holmwood, and Quincy Morris. And the thing about these 3 men is that they're all, I think Arthur Holmwood and Quincy Morris are better friends than they are with Dr. Seward, but it's a triumvirate, it's a trio of men who are interested in Lucy, and she can only choose one of them, and she chooses Quincy Morris, I'm pretty sure, because he's the American, he's the Texan, he's the adventurer, he has the gumption, he's the action person. And Dr. Seward is the booky one, where, you know, he's the overseeing doctor at the mental institution, the asylum, sanitarium, where Renfield is being kept for observation. And as you can track the progress of the vampire's influence through the entries in Dr. Seward's diary about Renfield, because as Dracula is on the Demeter, and he's sailing, from Transylvania through the Mediterranean around around Gibraltar to London to, he's traveling in these boxes of earth because he needs to have earth of his homeland to sustain his vampiric powers. But you track the progress of his influence through observing Renfield. And Dr. Seward is very analytical. He's very evidence-based. And in a sense, so is Mina Murray. And Mina really, I think, identifies kind of the changing place of women in society, that she's very educated. She's very intelligent. They compare her to a man in the book. And it seems like she's destined to be Jonathan Harker's legal secretary or paralegal in some sense, but she's educated. She's very good with assembling information and analyzing information, and she becomes the one who compiles all of these diary entries into one volume for when they do realize, the true evil of Dracula, and everyone sees it for themselves and believe it, and they resolve to defeat him. They use the compilation of all their collective diaries and clippings as kind of like a primer for each of them to catch up and stay on the same page, pun intended, with how things are going in the fight against Dracula. So through the novel, Mina's hanging out with Lucy, and there's this scene where they meet this guy in a churchyard that overlooks the Bay of London, and he's like kind of a lower class guy. And I forget his name. His name is Swales. And he gives this whole speech to Mina, and he has this thick, like, Yorkshire accent, which is literally written, very, like, phonetically written in the book and hard to read. But he gives he gives a long speech about how people's beliefs just aren't true, and how the cemetery they're standing in is full of lies, because all the headstones, if you dug them up, they'd be empty because they're all for men that died at sea. And there's this, I think, really important speech that he gives about the nature of people's beliefs and what they tell themselves to comfort themselves. And I think it really highlights this early on in the novel, highlights this theme of beliefs versus fact, and backwardsness versus going into the future, and being analytical about these things. There's things we want to believe and tell ourselves, but then there's the reality. And somehow that, I don't know exactly how that ties into it in a very specific sense, but I just picked up on that general theme. So then Harker realizes he's a prisoner. There's 3 harlots in like his harem, in Dracula's harem, that are all vampires, and they're feeding on him and keeping him weak. But he manages to escape after Dracula leaves to come to London. So he escapes. He's like falls into this convent of priests. I think it's like female nunnery, where they nurse him back to health, and they send word to Mina that he's coming home. So during this time, and I love the way that it's told, is there's a newspaper clipping about the Demeter crashing to land, and it's empty, and all they see is this like great wolf run off the dock, or off the deck of the ship, and into the city. And of course he goes to Carfax Abbey, which is where the chests of earth are to be delivered. And it's crazy how all this has been set up via post by Dracula for his arrival. And it seems like it'd be a huge risk for him to do this. And like, I would be nervous about it if I was Dracula trying to move all these chests. And all these things start happening. He starts preying on Lucy, and it happens slowly, where she's missing all this blood and no one knows where it's going. And she starts acting weird and having these strange dreams. And Mina sees it happen, sees her get bit because Lucy's sleepwalking, and she sees Dracula bite her, but she doesn't know what it means or what it is. She just sees a pair of red eyes. And Dr. Seward comes in to look after Lucy, and through all this, he's perplexed. He's watching Renfield go further and further into madness. And he calls his mentor Dr. Van Helsing. And Dr. Van Helsing is interesting because he really serves, despite being Dr. Seward's foil, or excuse me, despite being Dr. Seward's mentor, it's really strange that he ends up being a foil to Dr. Seward himself, because Dr. Seward is very analytical and science-based, and he wants to name Lucy's ailment for himself, although he cares about her a lot and was in love with her. He wants to save her, but he also wants to, name Renfield's ailment. And it's really what he describes it as being like an obsession with the devouring of life, like adding life forces to yourself, which I mean is obviously Dracula, like being a vampire. But he wants to name it, and he sees Lucy as kind of like an extension of that. So he calls in Dr. Van Helsing. Dr. Van Helsing eases everyone into this, but he starts with the premise that this is a scientific ailment that we can name and describe. But as the events take place throughout the book, he waits for everyone else to catch up with where he's at by observing all of these supernatural things happen. And then at the right moment, he confronts Dr. Seward and is like, damn it, man, this is obviously something beyond our ken, something that we can't understand with science, something that ancient peoples understood because they observed it and dealt with it. And in that sense, they're so much, more further along with this than you guys are, because they understood this. And I've been studying throughout my career ways to handle these folk ailments. And in a sense, like, there is this real anthropological phenomenon that I studied in my freshman year in college, where they talk about how these beliefs can be real, that these ascientific beliefs can be very real in almost a literal sense, because they are believed and imagined so intensely by the population who comes up with this. Like, for instance, they were talking about the hula folk in Iceland. And the hula folk are these little elves. And people in Iceland, they believe in this stuff. Some of them. I think it's turned into like a little bit of kind of a joke or whatever, but they will divert the construction of roads so as not to disturb the hula folk people, were these little elves. And I just remember part of what we were talking about in one of the lessons about how this anthropologist went there, lived on an Icelandic farm in I think it was like some pretty rough, like primitive conditions. But they were writing about how they were in this fog bank and they saw a hula folk, like in some kind of really getting into it kind of way, if you know what I mean, like really submersing yourself in this culture and then having this vision happen, or like some kind of quasi-real thing, this liminal space, this in-between space of the hula folk world and the real world. And I think that Van Helsing gets into it in a literal sense. He's not talking about like having this anthropological experience, but he's talking about like, yes, I've been studying these things and they literally exist and they're supernatural. There's no scientific explanation for it. We have to do the garlic and cutting off the head and plunging a stake through a heart. So Lucy dies, and then Van Helsing, in the way he convinces everyone that this is a real thing, is he takes everyone with him to kill Lucy after she's died and been buried, and he confirmed that her casket was empty. And then all these like newspaper clippings come that children have been killed, that she's feeding off of children. And he takes them all to, and there's a pretty gruesome scene for the time of them chopping Lucy's head off and driving a stake through her heart and all the blood and that kind of stuff. Really cool. Then, honestly, for me, this is where the book drags a little bit in the middle, like between Lucy, them executing Lucy. I mean, there's a few things where they're just chasing Dracula down, basically identifying where he would have placed these earthen boxes throughout London. And coming together. And basically, it was really touching to me through reading it that these characters are just so brave that I don't know if I would have acted the same way in that situation, where they're like, well, there's obviously like a greatest generation tilt to it, even though, I'm referring to World War II that didn't happen until 40 years later. But there's a really like greatest generation feel to it where they're like, well, we're the only people that know about this. We have to do something, right? Like we have to stop him. Someone has to stop him. He can't continue to live in the world, and especially he can't be living in London. We have to do something lest he, make everyone into thralls and have vampires all over the place. So we got to do something. So they go out destroying the earthen boxes and sanctifying them. And there's a confrontation scene in London where they go to his final estate, or one of his final estates, and he's there. And Jonathan Harker, who was basically traumatized in the beginning of the book, it takes a very brave stance to fight, like confronts Dracula. And it's a really cool scene. And then there's a lot of stuff about how like Harker uses his business ability, or his legal authority and ability to get these things. And then Quincy Morris, or not Quincy Morris, the other one. Oh God, Quincy Morris, Arthur Holmwood, the one I haven't talked about. Arthur Holmwood was the, I thought Lucy ended up being engaged to Arthur Holmwood and not the Texan Quincy Morris. But Holmwood uses his title because he's the son of Lord Godalming and inherits that title when his father dies in the book. But he uses that ability to finance this quest against Dracula because his fiance was killed by the monster. So there's some class commentary there about how, they use their aristocracy as resources and superpower to confront this evil. Then there's, kind of a little bit of a drawn out sequence where Dracula sees that he's been had in London, so he flees back to his castle to regroup and basically launch his assault somewhere else. And everyone chases him back to Transylvania, and they split up for reasons that I can't recall. I think like travel difficulties or not knowing exactly which river he's going to take or what route he's going to take back to his castle. So they split up and do all that, and they end up like, I think it's Mina and Van Helsing. Mina basically turns into a vampire because she's fed on in London. I missed that part. But Van Helsing ends up killing all of the harem of vampires that are in the castle because he beats Dracula there. And they end up heading off the group of people that I can't remember exactly what they're called, but Dracula has hired this group of people to take him back to the castle. And there's a fight. And I think it's Quincy Morris that gets stabbed and dies. Yes. And Arthur Holmwood survives. But they shoot a member of this group. And everyone, it all takes place at the final moment. But they shoot a member of the group of people who are paid to transport Dracula. And they're like, well, fuck this. We're getting out of here. And so they ended up, killing Dracula at the end. And it's really interesting. A great book, obviously iconic. The topic of religion is discussed a little bit because these iconography and these symbols of religion are introduced. But I think a lot of people have asked, well, why does Dracula stand the test of time? And I think it's because it's well written. It's accessible. It has literary merit to it. So it's not just a dime novel, but it combines this kind of base vampire myth with the upper class mystique of having nobility, like a member of the nobility be a vampire. And, you know, maybe it's Elizabeth Bathory, maybe it's Vlad Tepes himself. There's also an interesting like little side issue of apparently people in Romania love Vlad Tepes, and they say that the whole story of Vlad Tepes being like Dracula is a propaganda. I think it's like a Hungarian propaganda campaign that has gone to introduce basically a national hero, has gone to defile his name as a part of an info war against Romania. I think that's super interesting. And it, in a way, it like makes me feel a little bad, if I don't know how true that is, but it makes me feel a little bad that I got a Vlad Tepes tattoo with the Dracula iconography from, you know, from Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Coppola version with Gary Oldman in it, because it's essentially Gary Oldman. And yeah, so I just totally lost my train of thought. But at any rate, there it is. The thing that stands the test of time about this, I think, is the backward looking and merging it with the forward looking and identifying these things. And I don't know exactly, maybe some of you in the audience can comment about how you think that it interplays, but is there the forward looking, I guess, being analyzing that the scientism is going to be combining with old world beliefs, and how are those things going to interact? And I think, I guess I would play it into this kind of expertism that we experienced during, you know, the 2020 years with the illness that went around, and how they were saying, well, just trust the experts. And it turns out that, well, you know, our inner feelings and our instincts, more akin to, you know, maybe the legends of the past, proved to be correct in the situation, that, you know, this wasn't that big of a deal, that we shouldn't be taking these forced medical treatments, that we shouldn't just trust the experts, essentially. And I think that this is Dracula is so parallel of that. It's a very kind of parallel situation where you have the collision of scientism and science, and lying with science maybe, or science not being quite true, or missing something fundamental about the nature of good and evil, that there are things beyond that, there's wisdom beyond that, and that there's reality beyond that. Okay. I think that's Dracula. Now, moving forward, when I say that we need kind of a revival in horror, having a new conception of creature, or a new understanding of an element, I think about Ex Machina. Remember that movie that came out maybe 10 years ago about the robot? Now, we've had a lot of, I'm going to put it on the screen here, IMDb, Ex Machina from 2014, where we have the Turing test being applied to an android. And it's really creepy. Oh, of course, Elon Musk goes up there. I'm playing, for those of you just watching or listening to the video version, I'm playing the trailer from IMDb, and there's a quote from Elon Musk there, which we're going to talk about in a second, about the film. But I thought this was a great movie. I really enjoyed it, but it's kind of a horror film, I think it's a horror film. It says psychological thriller, drama, sci-fi, thriller, artificial intelligence. Basically, the film is about a programmer who's selected to participate in a groundbreaking experiment in synthetic intelligence by evaluating the human qualities of a highly advanced humanoid AI. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the movie about this. The creator of these human androids I think he's basically using them as sex slaves. And he creates one of them that passes the Turing test. and this programmer that comes to evaluate them, she makes him like has a love affair, like makes him fall in love with her, and then she uses that to escape, like uses him with her sexuality to escape from this crazy programmer who's been using the robots as sex slaves. Or at least she makes it seem like he is, which I think he is. It's been like 8 years since I've seen it. So, but I really value films like this. And I think that it was a very, in a sense, innovative. Like, it wasn't groundbreaking in the way that I think that Dracula was, or that Frankenstein was. I mean, definitely Frankenstein being the groundbreaking, innovative thing. But it's been like 100 years since then. I know we've had advances like in zombies, during the 60s, the zombie film. I don't think zombies translate as well to novel format as others, with exception. I mean, I'm thinking the Zombie Survival Guide and World War Z, which I tried reading in high school but didn't get through. And I want to do that. Like, I wish that I had the time and energy and ability to create the next visionary. I mean, of course, who wouldn't? But to think of something original that would capture, I think, the moment that we're in right now within the next 10 years, definitely with AI being as integrated, like we are rapidly at like the speed of light hurtling into some kind of new world, that the fourth turning, or whatever you want to call it, not the fourth turning, but the fourth industrial revolution, we are in the middle of it right now, and it's moving way faster, I think, than people realize. That we need cautionary tales right now more than anything. And that's not to say there haven't been cautionary tales, but I was thinking about this a lot in the last couple weeks with my wife, in the very small amount of free time that we have together. I don't know why I just talk about this stuff, but we've been having some nice discussions about what does the future look like? Because I was playing Kingdom Come Deliverance, and the first one, because I want to beat the first one before I play the second one. And it's so immersive. I mean, these open world games like Red Dead Redemption 2 and Kingdom Come Deliverance, and even the Grand Theft Auto films, the video games, are so immersive that the next step obviously is going to be some kind of neural network where you are literally matrixed into games, and AI having the capability to make NPCs be completely interactable, where they interact. I mean, essentially where video games becomes indistinguishable from waking life. And I think that's going to happen within my lifetime. And I don't know what the implications are for that, because when that comes about, we're going to have some serious grappling to do with that. And like Ready Player One, for all of its faults, which I detested that movie and that book. But for those of you who haven't seen it, it's like a kid who basically, video games have advanced to the point where you can completely be injected into it with a haptic suit, where you basically, it's a different reality, kind of like the Matrix. But I think, and these are some predictions, one of the biggest implications I think for this is people are going to be escaping into these worlds and not coming out, or not wanting to come out. I think also people are going to stop having sex with each other. Now, I might be wrong about this, but if you could, and I think this is already happening in Japan, right? We're going to have like a serious crisis here, because if you could just go into some kind of virtual reality program, and with complete, because it would be a neural chip, right? and you could have any situation that you wanted, why would you have sex with a human being where you could have any situation you wanted and it would be indistinguishable from real life without any of the consequences that you would have in real life? There's that, but there's also like this thing of, I really feel like there's an anti-natalist movement, like just throughout the world, but especially in our society, where, even as a parent, my wife was telling me about how she thinks that in other cultures, it is a lot more kid friendly, where people are a lot more tolerant of children being in public and being in public places. And I think that our culture in the United States frowns upon taking your kids into public with you. So people just generally seem like they're annoyed by it, that they don't want to assist you or convenience you by having these accommodations for your kids or having so few kid-friendly experiences. I get that feeling. There's also this whole idea of, and I was listening to a podcast this morning with James Corbett talking about algocracy, which is the idea of ruling through the algorithms, basically AI government, which I think I put out a tweet today that essentially what Doge is and what Elon Musk is and what they are doing is the spending cuts and the idea of making government more efficient sounds good, and everyone's buying into it because even, 70% approval rate, people think that making government more efficient or cutting government or having what Doge is doing, uncovering this wasteful spending, that's like the cheese in the trap. It's the red meat for essentially what it is taking the United States government and putting it down the fast track to integrating artificial intelligence with government, which is literally what's happening right now with Elon Musk and Doge, is that they're taking all of this government data and feeding it into AI algorithms to help them make decisions and incorporating AI into government services. And maybe that is behind, like, all these companies are probably doing it right now because everyone's adopting this kind of technology right now. And maybe it is just to keep up with the private sector, but the implications and the fact that no one really voted for this. I mean, they voted for Donald Trump. And that is kind of what, I guess, within the last couple months, Elon Musk jumped on board and said, oh yeah, we're going to be doing all this stuff and doing all that. But integrating these, like the Palantir, the PayPal mafia guys, to help apply and incorporate this technology, this AI technology, and having it be, essentially Minority Report, this idea that, or Enemy of the State, that movie with Will Smith, where facial recognition software is going to be able to track all of your moves in real time and fine you, like jaywalking, doing, or having minor traffic tickets, just no due process. The way all this works right now, there is due process. So there would have to be some significant developments. But even like in Canada, if you drive on a toll road and you don't pay the toll, they will ticket you by camera. They will scan your license plate and they will send you a citation in the mail for you to pay. Or it's like jaywalking, having your face be scanned. And this is already happening, where they scan your face and they just deduct the funds from your bank account. Something like that. And that's just the beginning of it. So I really have a lot of concerns about that. And I think that the role of fiction as a political tool in all these books that we remember and that stand the test of time, not just for its entertainment content, but I don't know if anyone really reads 1984 to be entertained. I certainly I don't think it's an entertaining book per se. I don't think, for that matter, I don't think that Brave New World is that entertaining as a book to read. I would say Fahrenheit 451 I found to be entertaining to read, and A Scanner Darkly I thought was entertaining to read, but you really straddle that line between like, well, what is this book really? Is this a plot-driven book, character plot-driven book with like an interesting conflict and resolution and a transformation of character? Or is this just, a thinly veiled political screed, which you don't want to do that. Certainly, I don't think it's that interesting to read. But we need something new. And I was going to talk about how I think The Passage fails to do that. But to be fair, I don't even think that was whatever Justin Cronin, the author of The Passage, intended his book to be. I don't think he did. But if you look at all the accolades for it, like look at all the people who were praising this book. The New York Times Book Review, Men's Journal, Entertainment Weekly, the Dallas Morning News, Parade, the Daily Beast, Bloomberg, Time Magazine, Washington Post, the Denver Post, Salon, the San Francisco Chronicle. Those are all the things on, the accolades on this book. And this came out in, I think, like 2011 or 2012. There was a book, or there was a pilot TV show, one season of it, that failed like miserably because this is hopelessly hard to adapt to the screen. But essentially what it is, it's very biblical. Like it's an epic fantasy, or it's an epic science fiction book where you have like, there's this, the book starts out, it's very like Game of Thronesy in the sense that it is told from the perspective of like 50 million different characters, and you have all of them start and you have no idea how they're related to each other at all, and you don't find that out for like 200 pages. But it's about, and it's kind of written like Dracula, where there's like news snippets here and there, but it's mostly narrative told from perspectives, but then there's some found footagey things. But essentially what it is these like Make-A-Wish Foundation people go on a hike somewhere in South America to discover this legend about this creature living in a cave that's lived there for a long time, or this hermit living in a cave that's lived there for a long time. And spoiler alert, it's like a vampire plague, right? And the US government gets a hold of this and accompany these Make-A-Wish people because they all have terminal illnesses. So they fund this expedition, which somehow the US military gets involved. I just don't remember. And this hermit in the cave kills everybody. And they capture, I think, the hermit, even though he killed a lot of people, and they take him to this outpost in Colorado, and they do like hardcore biological research on him. They create 12 vampires from patient zero, they call the creature they found in the cave. And each of them are like a Dracula in of themselves, where they have like these super, super duper powers. And there's one little girl that they abduct, and because the experiment's not working, like they're trying to create like a super soldier, and they're also trying to like solve all diseases, but the experiments aren't working. When they infect someone, they just turn into a Dracula. So they take this little girl and they infect her, and she turns into like Blade, right? Like a day walker, where she doesn't need to like drink blood or anything. And they're like, oh, this is, what we were always going for. But then like they get out and essentially infect the entire world, and the entire world turns into like post-apocalyptic whatever. And then 100 years goes by, And that happens like in the middle of the book. 100 years goes by, and all the characters that you spent the entire first half of the novel learning about, they all die, except for one or two. And you have to completely relearn an entire new set of characters. And everything's all kind of like weird because it's all like Fallout-y, you know, where there's like, I don't know, they live in a place called the Colony, and they have all this slang terminology for, they call them, they say flyers is their way of saying the F word, or they call them virals, like the vampires are called virals or Drax or something like that, which is a little hokey. Some of the things are like a little hokey, but this novel is a page turner when it's a page turner. And when it's not, it's like feels like a little bit of homework, but then it starts to be a page turner again. And there's like all these like love triangles, and like in the second half of the book, there's all these love triangles, and you have to just deal with it, I guess. But it's all about how like people come together, and it's very Dracula-y in that sense, where the way that the characters are always coming together is to, well, the way that they face certain doom is to come together, and the bonds between them and their love for each other kind of wins the day. It's kind of Dracula-y in that sense, because that's exactly what happens with Seward and Homewood and Harker and Mina and Van Helsing. That's what happens in Dracula. And it's very similar in that sense. And what happens is they eventually like decide, well, we have to go out and kill these 12 original vampires, and that's going to somehow stop the worldwide vampire plague. And it's very biblical in the sense that like there's 12 disciples, and some of these things are written in a literary sense, like the prose can be very biblical and have parallels that way too. But I just don't think like taking, and this is where it ties into Dracula and the broader thesis of this episode. I just don't think that this is innovative in any sense. And I don't think it's intended to be. But I think that we are starved for innovation in horror. And in a sense of social commentary and forward-thinking social commentary, like where it all started with Frankenstein. Mixing sci-fi with horror to create some kind of a new concept, something that captures this AI-ruled dystopia that I think that we're like careening into at this moment. Sorely, sorely needed. And just having like vampirism be a plague is not doing it. And again, I mean, with all due respect to Cronin, the author, who I don't think intended this to be some kind of like, genre opening, like genre expanding kind of innovative vampire tale. But I would definitely recommend it. I mean, it's a huge investment. I mean, the first book is like 900 pages. And the second book is a little shorter. And I think the third book is even a little shorter. I didn't bring them over here. So I think that fiction can be an incredible tool to highlighting problems and issues and trying to point other people to them, and essentially taking a premise and working it down through to its threads, to its roots, to really better understand our world and to critique it, especially with that forward-looking sense. So I think I'll leave it there. But I really appreciate you guys. I appreciate you watching this. libertarianinstitute.org. We met our fundraising goals, so we really appreciate that. Went over by about $3,500. Thank you guys. We really appreciate that. Head on over to vitaldescent.com and check out my work there. I also have my newsletter site, which is vitaldescent.club, my membership website. I want to do a little bit more with that. I think I'll be sending out sneak peeks of the project that I'm working on right now, which has to do with fiction. I'm just not going to fully announce it yet because I don't like, what if it doesn't happen? I think it's going to happen, but what if it doesn't? Anyways, but I did give a little sneak peek on my Twitter. It's at Pat McFarlane _ my Twitter. And yeah, so thank you. We'll catch you next time. Peace.